This happened a few years ago. A 22-year-old young man named Leo wanted to temporarily get away from months of mental exhaustion and some difficult stretches in his personal life. At that time, solitude and uninterrupted peace were what he needed most. That is why he chose a small, nearly uninhabited island near the coast of Maine. A small motorboat made the trip to the island from the mainland only twice a day. He arrived on the last trip of the afternoon. He had planned to spend a few days alone in an old wooden cottage he had booked online. At the time of booking, he had been told the cottage key would be kept in a lockbox and that he would not meet the caretaker in person. By the time Leo reached the island in the late afternoon, the whole place felt unusually quiet. In the distance, all he could hear was the roar of Atlantic waves crashing against the rocks and the whistling of a gusty wind. There were no human voices, no traffic sounds, not even bird song. It was as if all of it was simply missing. Within a few minutes of setting foot on the island, it struck him that this place felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. A heavy silence hung over the entire island, the kind that could feel unsettling from the very first moment. The cottage itself was very old. The marks of time were clear across its wooden walls, and inside, the salty sea air mixed with the smell of old wood to create a damp, musty atmosphere. Once evening fell, darkness swallowed the entire island very quickly. Leo was putting his things away, getting ready to rest. Because he had been using GPS all day, his phone battery had dropped to just 6%. Right at that moment, his phone charger suddenly stopped working. The mobile network on the island was already very weak to begin with. Within a few minutes, the phone died completely. In that moment, he realized that every form of contact with the outside world was now effectively cut off. Right around midnight, a sound drifted through the surrounding stillness. It was the crunch of heavy boots on the wet dirt path outside the cottage. It sounded like someone was moving toward the cottage very slowly, placing each step deliberately. At first, Leo assumed it might be the island caretaker or some local person who had come by for some nighttime errand. Pero, within moments, that assumption turned out to be wrong. Suddenly, the beam of a powerful flashlight hit the window pane from outside. The being swept back and forth, searching every corner of the room, as if trying to make sure whether someone was inside. Sensing that something was very wrong, Leo quickly slipped into a dark corner of the room and stood completely still. He knew that even the smallest sound of movement might reach the ears of whoever was standing outside. What happened next was even more terrifying. The metal handle on the cottage front door suddenly turned hard. It was obvious that someone outside was trying to open the door and get in. Within seconds, the handle started being turned over and over again. Then came heavy pounding on the door. The old wooden door shook with every blow. Even though the door was made of thick oak, every strike made it feel like just a few more hits might break it open. Fear made Leo's heart pound. He quickly hid himself in the dark space behind the bed. He sat there completely silent, even holding his breath. To him, every second seemed to stretch into an eternity. He could only wait, wondering whether the door would give way. Even in his terror, Leo glanced toward the window once. Outside, the flashlight beam stayed fixed on the glass for a few seconds. He was certain that if the person wanted to, he could have broken the old glass and gotten inside with a single blow. But strangely, he did not. Instead, he stood silently for a few moments and then turned back toward the door again. That is when a terrifying realization first hit Leo. It seemed the man had not come to break into the cottage at all. He had come to terrify whoever was hiding inside. A few seconds later, a low, cold, An unnervingly calm voice drifted in from the other side of the door. There was no hesitation in it. The man said clearly, "I know you are in there, Leo." Hearing those few words, the blood in Leo's body seemed to freeze for a moment. This was a stranger who had no way of knowing he was even on this remote island, no logical way of knowing his name. And yet, not only did this person know his name, he clearly also knew Leo was hiding inside the cottage. That realization terrified him even more than the pounding on the door had. For roughly the next hour, the unknown person kept moving around the cottage. Sometimes, there was the sound of a slow, deliberate tapping on the window pane. Other times, came the sound of footsteps passing along the back of the cottage. Every so often, everything would go completely silent for a few minutes, and then the footsteps would start up again. The strange thing was, the man never tried to break down the door again. Instead, his behavior gave off the feeling that his real goal was not to get inside at all, but to terrify whoever was hiding in there. That uncertainty made the whole situation even more horrifying. Leo did not dare come out of his hiding spot. He could only wait for this nightmare to end. Suddenly, every sound stopped. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Then, from the direction of the distant dock, came the loud roar of a motorboat engine starting up. The sound slowly faded into the distance until it disappeared completely. That is when Leo guessed that the unknown man had probably left the island. The next morning, before leaving the island, he took a good look around the cottage. In the mud left wet by the night rain, he could clearly see the prints of a person's heavy boots. But the most unsettling part was that the prints were not just in front of the door. They circled around the cottage again and again, as if someone had spent a long time watching every single reaction of the person inside. After that, the tracks led straight toward the dock and ended there. None of it had been his imagination. The proof was lying right there in front of him. Back on the mainland, he reported the whole incident to the local sheriff office. They checked records from nearby marinas, ferry docks, and boats, but no suspect was found, and the identity of that night motorboat was never confirmed. Later, he reached out to the people closest to him and confirmed that not one of them had known he had gone to that isolated island. Who had followed him out to that isolated island that night? How had that stranger known his name or figured out his completely secret location? To this day, none of those questions have ever been answered. There is only one thing Leo knows for certain. That person knew exactly where he was. And that is the realization that still terrifies him most, even now. Because whenever he is alone somewhere remote, he still sometimes feels that someone might be standing silently in the dark, already knowing everything about the fact that he is there. This happened about a dozen years ago. A gentleman who worked as a structural engineer traveled to Japan for his research. His main goal was to observe how years-old concrete breaks down under ocean weather and saltwater exposure. For this work, he chose the famous abandoned island of Hashima off the coast of Nagasaki. This was an island that had sat empty of people for years and years. A local professor, Dr. Yamamoto, had arranged all the administrative permissions for the research. To help him move around inside the island, the professor hired a local guide named Takashi. They reached Hashima Island in the morning on a small research boat. For the next few hours, they went around observing the concrete decay, cracks, and structural condition of the island's different buildings. Moving from one building to the next, they didn't even notice how noon slipped into afternoon and afternoon slipped into evening. As his last observation of the day, He brought Takashi along and stepped inside a 4-story residential building. As he walked down a narrow corridor, he suddenly noticed something on the floor. There were fresh footprints on top of years of thick, undisturbed dust. As a structural engineer, he knew that clear prints like this couldn't naturally form on dust that had been untouched for so long. It felt like someone had walked through there just a little while ago. When he pointed this out to Takashi, the guide said in a very cold voice that these were probably just wind or some old trace. No one lived here, but the moment he stopped in front of one room, he caught a strange smell that didn't match the damp, wet air at all. When he stepped inside and touched the wall, he felt that it was unnaturally hot. He had a good enough understanding of concrete's normal temperature, so he could not find any acceptable reason for this warmth. He wanted to examine the matter more closely, but because of Takashi's rigid, unyielding behavior and the building's growing sense of unease, he reluctantly followed the guide toward the second building. Looking back on it later, it seemed to him that Takashi had been trying to avoid certain specific parts of the island from the very start. After going up to the second floor of the other building, the atmosphere grew even heavier. Inside a half-broken room there, he saw a worn-out blanket and a few empty water bottles. There was almost no dust on the bottles, and the blanket was lying in a way that suggested someone had used it recently, not long ago at all. Seeing these signs of human presence filled him with intense unease. Right at that moment, he noticed that Takashi was no longer beside him. Thick darkness was closing in on all sides. He turned around to call out for Takashi. At that exact moment, a tremendous crashing sound shook the entire building. A large section of the staircase, weakened by years of decay, collapsed and completely blocked the way. As a cloud of dust spread through the air, a heavy breathing sound drifted over from the other side of the staircase. Then he heard the slow, scraping shuffle of several pairs of feet on wood. It wasn't just one person. It felt like several shapes were silently closing in on him through the darkness. The sounds seemed to be getting closer and closer. There was no time left to waste. Gripped by intense fear and panic, he found a worn-down emergency staircase on the other side of the building. He made his way down and somehow ran toward the coast. He never had the courage to find out whether the sounds had actually followed him. He didn't look back, not even once. Reaching the shore, he was shocked to see Takashi sitting calmly on the boat. Takashi looked at him as if nothing at all had happened. He could not, in any way, figure out how Takashi had gotten out of the building and back to the boat before him. He never got an answer to the question of whether Takashi knew some unknown alternate route on the island. Even when he tried to ask, Takashi gave him no answer. For the entire boat ride back, Takashi just stared at the sea without blinking. After returning to the United States, he tried many times to get in touch with Dr. Yamamoto, but none of his attempts succeeded, and after that, he was never able to find any reliable information about the professor again. He also reported the matter to the local authorities, but no one believed that anyone could be living on that uninhabited island. Even today, his skin still crawls whenever he remembers the fresh footprints on the dust. He remembers the unnaturally warm wall and that heavy breathing sound that drifted out of the darkness on that island. Afterward, he tried many times to find a logical explanation for every part of what happened, for the footprints in the dust, and for the blanket and water bottles that seemed recently used. A real, practical explanation was maybe possible to find, but for that unnaturally warm wall inside a building abandoned for so many years, for Takashi's behavior, and for the sound of multiple footsteps he heard on the other side of the staircase, he never found any acceptable explanation. In the end, there was only one thing he was certain of, that he did not know the explanation for everything he saw and heard that day on Hashima Island. This happened several years ago. North Brother Island, sitting in the East River in New York City, was still completely off limits to the public back then. The main character of this story is Ryan, a young history student. He was writing a research thesis about the city's abandoned and forgotten places. As part of that research, one night he made a decision with his two close friends, Jansen and Jesse, a decision whose consequences none of them could have imagined. It was around 2:30 in the morning. An unnatural, heavy silence had settled over everything. From behind a quiet, empty park in the Bronx, they lowered 3 kayaks into the cold river water. Their goal was to secretly reach that forbidden island. Cutting slowly through the current, they finally set foot on the island's muddy shore. Thick trees and plants all around, old buildings buried under vines, and a silence that had been building up for years without a single person around. It all wrapped the place in an atmosphere so heavy, it felt like the darkness itself had made a home there. After landing on the island, they spent a few minutes looking around. Jansen and Jesse were shining their flashlights on a few abandoned walls and talking about painting graffiti on them. At first, Ryan tried to talk them out of it, but they didn't take it seriously. Ryan realized there was no point arguing with them and that he was wasting his own research time, so he headed off alone toward the island's main hospital building. The moment he stepped inside the building, a long, dark corridor greeted him. Wind slipped in through gaps in the broken roof, making a low, howling sound. Every step he took echoed with a dry, crackling sound against the old bits of plaster scattered across the floor. The silence around him was so thick that even the sound of his own breathing felt strangely loud in his ears. After walking a little way down the corridor, a very clear voice suddenly came from a dark room on his right. The moment he heard it, Ryan's feet froze in place. It was exactly his friend Jesse's voice, but the strangest part was that Jesse's voice had no business reaching him from that far away. Yet the sound rang in his ears right from behind the door, almost like a whispered call. In here. Ryan thought that maybe Jesse had circled around some other way and gotten here first, trying to fool him. In a low voice, he called out Jesse's name once. No answer came. Still thinking it was just some prank from his friends, he walked up and stood in front of the door. Slowly, he pointed the thin beam of his flashlight into the room, and in that instant, the blood in his body seemed to turn to ice. Right in the corner of the room, facing the wall, a huge figure stood there in total silence. In the faint flashlight beam, all he could tell was that it was unnaturally tall. What was even more terrifying was that even when the flashlight beam landed directly on it, it didn't move at all. No reaction, no sound. It just stood there, unnaturally still, as if it had been waiting in that same position for a very long time. Ryan's chest shook with terror. He didn't dare stay there for even one more moment. He turned, ran back down the corridor as fast as he could, and started shouting for his friends, gasping for breath. When he finally made it outside the hospital, he could see Jansen and Jesse's flashlight beams swaying in the darkness in the distance. They were still quite far from the hospital, standing next to a broken wall. When Ryan reached them, he told them everything that had happened. Hearing the details, Jansen said, shocked, that Jesse had been with him the entire time. Neither of them had gone inside the hospital building or even gotten close to it. Hearing that, a cold wave seemed to wash over Ryan's body all over again. So then, who had called him a few moments ago? In that exact voice of Jesse's from inside that dark room. It didn't take them even a second to understand how bad the situation was. None of the three of them were willing to risk staying there another moment. They started running toward the riverbank. Ryan was still trying to make sense of what had just happened moments before. Right then, cutting through the deep darkness around them, came the sound of an old woman crying and wailing in pain. The sound was so clear that it didn't seem to be coming from very far away at all. And yet, at that hour, there shouldn't have been a single person on that forbidden island. In the silence, that crying felt even more unnatural, even colder. They ran back to the spot where they'd tied the kayaks to the shore with rope. Somehow, they got the ropes untied, dropped the kayaks into the water, and started paddling toward the far shore with everything they had. None of them dared to find out what might have been left behind, or whether something had really been watching them. Ryan spent a long time afterward trying to reason his way to an explanation for what happened that night. But there was one question he never found an answer to. Ever since that night, the question still follows him to this day. That night, deep in the dark, inside a locked room of that abandoned hospital, who, or what, had called out to him in his friend's exact voice.